Well, welcome everyone to Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation and to our weekly research seminar. For those of you who are new to our seminar, my name is Harold Trinkunas, and I am the Center's Deputy Director. It is a great privilege to welcome today our guest speaker, Professor Maxime Polleri. Dr. Polleri is on the faculty of the Department of Anthropology at Université Laval in Quebec, Canada. As an anthropologist of technoscience, he studies the governance of disasters, waste, and misinformation, with a primary focus on nuclear issues and on Japan. Today, he will be speaking to us on his new book, Radioactive Governance, The Politics of Revitalization in Post-Fukushima Japan. He will be speaking for about 45 minutes, and then I will moderate a Q&A session for the balance of our time. Before we get started, please feel free to enter questions in the Q&A function in Zoom at any time. During the Q&A period, I will attempt to unmute you if possible so that you can ask your own question, or if not, I will read out your question. As per our usual custom, I will ask 2 or 3 of our postdoctoral fellows to ask the first questions. So without much further ado, over to you, Professor Polleri.
Well, hello everybody. Thank you very much for having me. Let me just share my slides with you. Perfect. So first of all, thank you very much, Dr. Trinkunas. Must say it's my great pleasure to give this talk at CSEC. My time as a fellow at CSEC was really fundamental in shaping the direction of the book, and I've made also great colleagues who became also long life friends. So it was a wonderful experience. So today I'm going to talk to you about my new book, Radioactive Governance, which talks about the aftermath of Japan's worst nuclear civilian disaster. So the first time that I went to Japan to start this research, I did a lot of field work with Japanese farmer. So basically, former rice farmers who had been forced to evacuate after the disaster. And when I came to their place in 2015, for instance, a lot of them were finally able to come back to Fukushima. And there was one farmer that one day told me, you know, Maxime, I'm so happy to finally be back in Fukushima. You know, it's the place where I was born. I always wanted to come back to this place, see the sunrise, see the moon at night, seeing the blueness of the sky. So for this individual, the real threat of the disaster had been the evacuation. But I also did a lot of field work with a Japanese mother who had been forced to evacuate or that sometime had evacuated by themselves. And these mother told me very different things. So one mother, for instance, told me, well, you know, the government is constantly repeating the slogan of recovery and reconstruction. And in doing so, well, they encourage us to come back to what we perceive to be areas of high risk. And when we criticize how the disaster is being handled, we are being called unpatriotic by our community or by the political elites. So as you hear these kind of 2 very different stories, you might think that they refer to 2 distinct historical events, to 2 distinct disasters, as the experience, the portray are so different. The same could be said about what is radiation hazard. So from something that precluded a farmer to come back to his beloved land, radiation could also be a risk that was experienced beyond one's own body, so to the children, for instance. Of course, you know, there's a gray zone between these 2 extremes, but at the same time, there's one particular narrative that has gained a lot of momentum in defining the scope, the scale, and the effect of this disaster. And the core argument of my book is that we have been seeing dominant practice of governance that have created a master narrative around the disaster. And that's a narrative that I call a politics of revitalization. And this is a politics that basically emphasizes a gradual repatriation of former evacuees, a restarting of the country's nuclear power plants, the promotion of a resilient mindset, and also a discourse of minimal or no radiation-related dangers. And that's a narrative that has been performed against other understanding of risk or recovery. So Basically, the book is really a critique of post-disaster recovery politics. I'm not criticizing recovery per se. We all want recovery after a disaster. But what I'm criticizing is the specific direction that recovery has took. So basically, who or what is included in this recovery? What is rendered invisible? What is rendered invisible? Sorry. What are the social factors, the cultural values, the global pressure that shapes the governance of this disaster? And how is it also that, in Japan or globally, there's this discourse that described Fukushima as being either a disaster in the past or as being a disaster that was less worse than it was. So it's an interesting politics, especially if we compare it with other nuclear tragedies. So if we look, for instance, at the bombing of Hiroshima or Nagasaki, if we look at the Chernobyl disasters, these nuclear tragedies, they were initially inseparable from politics of secrecy, a politics of victimization. Um, in contrast, there's a few people that remember Fukushima. A lot of you are experts in nuclear subjects, so of course you know about it. But when I was in Japan, a lot of people were surprised that a gaijin, a foreigner, was studying this disaster. They thought it was over. So I've looked at disaster recovery by especially focusing on the concept of governance. And, I'm not a political scientist, so of course, state institutions are important, but I've also looked at the role of citizens or non-governmental organization in the role of governance. So looking at how these different actors are going to clash, but also collaborate to manage something as controversial as risk or recovery after this disaster. And basically, I'm going to look at the different strategies, the different factors that have consolidated this politics of revitalization through a process I call radioactive governance. And basically, in pure science, radioactivity, it's simply a phenomenon where an unstable element gradually become more stable. And my anthropological interest is kind of similar. I want to look at what are the governance process that transformed Fukushima from an unstable situation of crisis in 2011 to a tropes of recovery, to a scenario of recovery? And each chapter of the book is going to look at one sub-aspects of radioactive governance, so the strategies that transform an initial situation of crisis into recovery. So in terms of contribution, one of the first contribution I wanted to make was to trace the historical evolution of governance practice around nuclear disaster and radioactive contamination. And Fukushima is very different from what we've been seeing during Chernobyl, which occurred during the Cold War under Soviet occupation. Disaster that was wrapped in secrecy, that was initially wrapped in opacity. And the argument that I want to make is that what characterized post-Cold War democratic society is rather a governance that increasingly relies on international organization and also its own citizen to manage the aftermath of nuclear disaster or crisis. So for me, Fukushima really embodies a shift into the transnational governance of risk and also its population co-management of nuclear catastrophe. So that's a sharp contrast with other historical events when states often carefully guarded incidents because of Cold War politics, and when many citizens also were unaware of the scale of contamination. Another contribution is to propose a richer theorization of governance. So if we look at the literature that surrounds disaster studies, we often see the same kind of scenario. So basically, citizens represented as victims against the normative viewpoints of a larger dominant force, sometimes the states, sometimes the corporation. So we basically have a David versus Goliath narrative, which is all right, but it also creates some problems. And the problems that I have with this narrative is that first, it prevents us from understanding the complexity of the governance. Too often, it's going to create a caricature of the states as a kind of homogeneous entity that work without contradiction. But for instance, in Japan, there's a lot of sectionalism within ministry, and I've often saw during my fieldwork that different ministries were managing very different aspects of radiation symbolism or materiality. So there was a lot of contradiction within the states. Secondly, if we're in the narrative of David versus Goliath, we also sometimes idealize resistance, and this conceals how citizens can also create their own sources of violence. And if we only look at states and civil society, we might also fail to examine the impacts of other actors that don't necessarily fall into these categories. So I've also looked at a lot the role of market ideologies and the monopoly of international experts in this governance. And finally, there's this kind of big debates across social science, which is, do major shock, do major crises lead to radical change? And I want to argue that, crises do not necessarily create a kind of tabula rasa, which lead to free-for-all social cultural change. So change do happens, but they always transpire in dialogue with prior social elements, which drastically affect the realm of possibility for the transformation of cultural and social institution after a crisis. So very rapidly in terms of method, I'm an anthropologist. Basically, we do ethnographic research, which means that we go on the field, we speak with people, we look at what's behind number, what's behind official scenarios, and so on. So a lot of interviews in Japanese with different kind of people that were affected by the disaster, and also a lot of observation. So looking at the daily experience of people living with the aftermath of a disaster. So I went to public demonstration, I measure residual radioactivity, I visit evacuee in temporary accommodation, and so on. And there's also an ethical reflection. What does it mean to study a disaster as an academic, as an anthropologist who does not live in Fukushima? It can be very easy to criticize this disaster when we're not necessarily living in the place. So briefly about the context for those who don't know much about Japan, the disaster happened in the prefecture of Fukushima. A prefecture, it's the equivalent of a state, northeast of Tokyo. Fukushima was always a poorer prefecture, very depopulated, and basically the electricity that they were producing was for Tokyo. So in a way, Tokyo was importing the benefit but exporting the risk. And when the disaster happened, you basically had a mandatory evacuation that ranged across 20 kilometers from the power plants. After the disaster, what is also important to put forward is that the state basically augmented the annual radiation exposure by more than 20 times. This was a decision that was taken by the Japanese government under recommendation of international expert organization, often to limit the scope of the evacuation. Because at one time there were even some scenarios about potentially evacuating Tokyo. And can you imagine a metropolis of 40 million people that had to be evacuated? That would have been another disaster in and of itself. But it's still a decision that created, major public outcry, major national protests. So for instance, if tomorrow the US federal government were telling you that lead can be augmented by 20 times in the drinking water, of course, people will be angry about it. Very rapidly, there was a lot of different international organizations like IAEA, the World Health Organization, that began to put a kind of official health narrative. Something that's also very different from 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl, where states were very able to put forward a kind of narrative that they wanted in regard to a nuclear disaster. And their narrative was basically that the level of radiation were too low to pose any major health risk, that the more serious source of harm will be the psychological fear, and that an evacuation based on former threshold will have caused too many problems. But if we want to understand Fukushima, it's important to go back in history and to look at how did a country like Japan that faced the nuclear rat during World War II bombing came to embrace nuclear power. And nuclear power was really put forward in the 50s. It was heavily influenced by the United States, by the geopolitics of the Cold War. The United States wanted an ally with nuclear power. And of course, in public, it was mostly promoted via tropes of peace, scientific advancement, technological wonder, the atom for peace narrative. But at the time, there was still a huge allergy to nuclear. We can think about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So political elites really had to reshape the collective imagination around nuclear energy. And they basically created a myth of nuclear safety, the belief that disaster cannot happen. There were different strategies to put this myth forward. I'm just going to talk about one strategy. One strategy, for instance, was education. You can see on the little image, you have Mr. Pluto. So Pluto-kun which tells the children that you can drink a plutonium lace soda. It's not bad for you. There's also to the right an educational pamphlet created by the Ministry of Education called Waku Waku Genshiryoku Lando, the exciting land of nuclear power. So they also try to create much love for nuclear power. And what was really important was also the creation of affective structure that permeated the imaginary of Japanese people by creating not only acceptance, but really love for the infrastructure of nuclear power. And when I interview a former nuclear engineer in Japan, everybody talked to me about this little guy, Astro Boy, a little robot that was powered by nuclear energy. So this was a love for nuclear power that was so strong that it even changed the role of Godzilla, so the big mutant dinosaur. If you look at the first movies of Godzilla is basically a bad monster, but as the love for nuclear energy grew in Japan, his role began to shift. He became a monster that fight other monsters to often protect Tokyo. So that's a context that really influenced the managerial mindset associated with nuclear disaster. Because they believed that a disaster could not happen, there was often no evacuation drill and a lot of sometimes falsification of data. So going back to Fukushima, one of the first things that I've studied after this disaster was the role of expertise. So what is an appropriate expertise to govern this disaster? And at the beginning of my research, I really look at official conference where often different experts describe very different disaster. And what I've looked at is how experts, talk about radiation, what is considered to be harmful for them, how do they speak about recovery? And I was really interested in putting forward how a successful politics of revitalization was also inseparable from governing certain regimes of expertise. And in post-Fukushima Japan, a proper expertise was really much a political issue. It was mediated by social pressure, by culture of science, by state-approved policies. It was very much influenced also by the Abenomics, so the policy of the late Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, which really tried to put Japan back as an economic juggernaut. And this really shaped the understanding of post-Fukushima recovery by giving it an economic flavor. So one of the first things I did was to went to official conference, so state-sponsored conference that talk about radiation risk. And in these conference, often experts were talking about radiation risk as something that created anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. To the right, you can see a picture that was drawn by a children, and it doesn't look like a very happy picture. So a lot of people were telling that children had PTSD. People also spoke about harmful rumor after the disaster. Basically, a lot of people stopped buying food in Fukushima. They stopped going to Fukushima. So that created a lot of economic hardship for the regions. And also, these experts were often telling the public that more people that die from the natural disaster, the earthquake or the tsunami that came before the nuclear disaster, and these were the real disaster. And they had also very optimistic views on the harmful biological effects of the disaster, did not believe that radiation had caused a problem. So by moving beyond these tropes of urgency, uncertainty, or biological damage, these experts also created the narrative of a second disaster that was epitomized by reputational damage or ongoing discriminatory practice. So for them, it appears that prejudice was the main hazards affecting Fukushima. Radiation, not so much. But I've also talked with a lot of other experts, often in medicine and epidemiology, that were very critical about the biological risk of radiation release. And basically, I've looked at how this politics of revitalization that had an economic flavor to it really prevented these experts from acquiring authority in the public spheres. So when I spoke with these experts that were critical of the risk of radiation, a lot of them told me that they face a lot of pressure. Sometimes superiors complained to them that their opinion was inconvenient. They faced threats of having their research budget cut. They were not invited to official symposia. And a lot of these experts, they did not understand this term, fuyo higai, which is damage by rumor. They were telling me, well, you know, Maxime, radiation, it's not damage by rumor, it's a real damage. And basically, when these experts spoke about radiation hazard, they were often depicted by, you know, other experts or by political elites as further increasing the anxiety, the discrimination, or the marginalization of Fukushima because they were seen in a way as hampering the financial recovery of the region. And it's interesting if we put this concept of harmful rumor in comparison with the term radiophobia, which was really put forward after Chernobyl. The word says it, radiophobia. It's a phobia. It's a false fear of radiation. And this was really put forward after Chernobyl to basically cut compensation by saying to people, well, the risk is in your head. The Japanese state did not use radiophobia. They've used rather this concept of damage by rumor. And while radiophobia is much more an individual problem, the problem is in your head, the damage by rumor concept, it's much more a kind of collective outcome, which is inseparable from a policy that emphasizes the socioeconomic recovery of the region. And that's interesting because it really enabled the states to bypass scientific claims of radiation hazard. Because basically what the states has been saying is we're not telling you scientists that what you're saying is wrong. We're just telling you that if you keep talking about the potential risk of radiation damage, it might be very inconvenient because you're not going to help people to recover from the disaster. So that was a very indirect ways of governing the disaster. You're going to see that this indirect forms of governance is something that keeps creeping back in the governance of Fukushima. So basically, we had here politics of revitalization that really shapes the regime of expertise that came to dominate the official risk communication. I've also looked a lot at the citizen movement. So after the disaster, for instance, you had a lot of citizens that began to independently collect data. So as you can see on the picture, they use monitoring device to track radiation. And sometimes these citizens, they find lots of contamination and they interpreted their finding as saying that Fukushima was dangerous. So that's a narrative that was really different from that of the government. It's a movement that took many names, but was mostly called citizen science, so Shimin Kagaku. So during my fieldwork, I followed a lot of worried mothers or people that had evacuated on their own. And basically, their practice of monitoring was really useful for them because it enabled them to map radiation beyond what the state was doing. So, for instance, at the beginning, the States was giving a map of radiation that showed the average of a city. But this average was kind of meaningless for people. They wanted to know what's the radiation level in my backyard, for instance. And they realized sometimes that the radiation level in the backyard is way higher than the average of the city. So this for them really highlighted the limitation of the states. And a lot of these citizens, they have used their data to promote a politics of victimization. And in English, when we talk about victimization, we often have this very negative connotation. But in Japanese, there's a lot of different words to talk about victimization. And one of the words that I kept hearing was tojisha, which is basically not a passive form of victimization, but an active form of victimization. So people were using the data to try to get recognized as official victims of the disaster. So I follow a lot of these citizens in public demonstration, in association with the former hibakusha, so the people that were exposed to radiation after the bombing, at trials, at district courts. And unfortunately for them, it's a policy that resulted in legal failure. The government did not recognize their claim of victimhood. There's even a reconstruction minister that says that since these people had evacuated by themselves, well, they had to take self-responsibility. So these citizen scientists, you know, they failed to bring drastic government change, but they did create alternative narratives about the disaster. And at the end of the speech, you're going to see how there was another facet of citizen science and how this other facet of citizen science was quickly backed up by the states to enter into the governance of the disaster. One of the other things that I've looked at was technical fix. So I've looked a lot at monitoring and decontamination. And I want to argue that these measures, so monitoring and decontamination, they had functions that were not only pragmatic, but also highly symbolic. Even when their effectiveness was really limited, they did contribute to shape specific narratives of control, and they were used to legitimize this politics of revitalizations. So one of the power of monitoring is that it really allowed the state to shift from qualitative concerns to quantitative risk. So qualitative concerns are things that are hardly governable for a state. So questions such as, can I let my clothes hang outside? Is the food that I produce in my garden safe? These are case-by-case questions, and no government of the moment is able to answer that. But monitoring was able to transform these qualitative concerns into quantitative risk. So, for instance, saying the average radiation city in your town is below 20 millisievert per year, and hence we consider that this is safe. The monitoring has also enabled the state to subdivide Fukushima into different recovery zones. So as you can see on the left, you basically had a very huge evacuation zone, and after you had a subdivision of Fukushima into 3 different recovery zones. Basically, they were not considered to be zones that were necessarily contaminated, but zones that were open to different timeline of recovery. And decontamination also work in tandem with the monitoring. As you can see on the little picture, decontamination often meant, taking contaminated soil and putting it in plastic bags, doing some power washing in houses. And decontamination was really used to avoid the loss of territory, which has always been a historical fear for Japanese elite. And the decontamination also allowed a change in regional zoning. That is, after the contamination, you basically pass from a contaminated area to uncontaminated areas, and this allowed the states to cut forms of compensations. But beyond the labs, beyond the models, there was also a limit in monitoring. And what I've realized often was that states map were more or less useful for everyday life. So what you see on the right are 3D printed maps that were created by farmers. So farmers that were very unsatisfied with state monitoring, and they basically said, the average result, it's useless for us, so we're going to create our own map. And the problem with radioactive fallout is that it's a case-by-case situation. You can literally walk a couple of meters and you're going to have a very, very different measure. And this kind of case-by-case problematics, it's not something that the government can really, again, manage. The other limits of monitoring is that maps, they only show part of contamination. So most of these maps are based on what we call external radiation. But if you ingest or inhale these radioactive pollutant, that's another risk that's not necessarily factors into the maps. Decontamination also might sound highly technical when you hear the word, but it was often a synonym of taking soil and putting it in plastic bags, and that created a lot of problems. So for instance, these bags, they often accumulate, and I had farmers telling me, for instance, well, when I wake up in the morning, I have my cup of green tea, and the first thing that I see is this mountain of black plastic waste. Of course, my daughter doesn't want to come back to Fukushima, but then I'm not able to see my grandchildren. So that created a lot of problem beyond radiation risk. The other problem is that the decontamination policy is not done in forests and mountainous areas, and that used to represent 75% of the region. And that was part of the culture of Fukushima, to go in the mountain, to do some hiking, to pick mushrooms. But despite these shortcomings, these decontamination and monitoring were really powerful symbolic tool because they showed Japan on the verge of recovery, and they were even used to basically gain the Olympics. So symbolically speaking, they have really worked in producing an image of Japan that was finally post-disaster and that was uncontaminated. After that, I've also looked a lot at the role of nostalgia for the native land. So I've looked at how one specific ministries have mobilized notion of nostalgia around this concept of the Furlusato, so the native land. And basically, every country have these kinds of concept. In Canada, we have the Great North. In America, you have the concept of the frontier. So this kind of broader concept about the ethos of a country. And basically speaking with this rural imaginary was very much a political touchstone for tackling recovery. So when I spoke with state ministers and bureaucrats, a lot of them told me, well, we are doing this decontamination because people cannot come back to their native land, and it creates a lot of anxiety for them. The thing that was interesting also is that if you went to Japan, that there is a lot of internal traveling. One prefecture, one region is going to be known for its specific food, for its specific terroir. And beyond the loss of land for people, the Japanese government was also framing the disaster as a loss of culture, saying, well, if we don't decontaminate, that's going to be a communal loss for Japan. There's a whole spectrum of our culture that's going to disappear. And I also went to basically temporary housing in which official evacuees were living. And indeed, a lot of these evacuees told me that they miss their native land. But they also told me that their native land, it was not just a place. It was also an idea. It was also a community. And they basically told me that after this disaster, well, this community has disappeared. So if we come back to our native land, it's not going to be the same as before because, my community has changed. There is no service whatsoever. There was also people that had been living in temporary housing for some time close to 6 years. So they had created whole new communities and they were very afraid of losing once again this community. So we can see that cultural narratives, they do contribute to forge powerful national imaginaries that influence the governance of controversial issues. And when we speak about technological disaster, we often write a lot about the strategic mobilization of science, but managing the place cultural imaginaries is sometimes as powerful as science, if not more so. After that, I've also looked at the role of uncertainty regarding nuclear power in Japan. So I've looked at how uncertainty can be deployed to render otherwise incommensurable risk commensurable, which create a kind of hierarchies of urgencies, which going to depoliticize debates about radiation dangers. So for some state agencies, the uncertainties that are linked with the abandonment of nuclear power are going to trigger political turmoil of a higher order than those linked with the contamination of Fukushima. And to study this, I've spent a lot of time looking at the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. And this ministry was the former nuclear regulator, sorry. And basically after the disaster, nuclear power was shut down for safety inspection, and that used to represent more than 30% of Japan's energy. Um, so I really look at how does this ministry conceptualize these uncertainties in tandem in dialogue with the contamination of Fukushima. So when I spoke with the bureaucrats of this this ministry, when I went to their official conference, I often heard the same three uncertainty that were put forward regarding the shutting down of nuclear power. So for instance, people said that shutting down nuclear power will create a lot of uncertainty related to energy security. A lot of questions around Japanese expertise in the nuclear field. And also, if you went to Japan in August, you know that it's pretty hot. So people were wondering, without nuclear power, will we be able to face the threat of climate change? But these uncertainties, they were also linked with very specific imaginaries. First, they demonstrate that nuclear power, it's not just an issue of electricity for this ministry. It's also an issue of independence, especially regarding the geopolitical tension of East Asia, where Japan sometimes have bad relation with its neighbor. And some ministers were telling me, well, we have bad relationship with Korea or China, and we can't depend on these countries. With nuclear power, we can be much more independent. Secondly, there was also a technological pride. So beyond electricity, nuclear energy was always important for Japanese scientists to, advance research or for the medical domains. And a lot of people were afraid that this was a spectrum of expertise that might disappear after the disaster. And third, there was a fetishization of nuclear power as something that could take care of environmental problems. So the state could no longer said that nuclear power was clean, but it now said that it could be used to fight climate change. The thing that's interesting is that when I spoke with these bureaucrats, no one told me that Fukushima was all right. No one told me that, there's no disaster. They all acknowledged that, yes, this has been a horrible disaster. Yes, there's still a problem of contamination, but they were often telling me that for them, there were other uncertainties that they consider more important. And for them, radioactive contamination was framed within uncertainty that were deemed less urgent. So the uncertainty that were important for them, it was energy security, it was technological expertise, it was global warming, and they were framing them as uncertainties that were more important than radioactive contamination. So that's very, very different than the politics of secrecy, something that we see, for instance, after Chernobyl. What we rather have, it's a specific distribution of urgencies, that are going to contain disruptive uncertainty for the states. After that, I've also looked a lot at the educational infrastructure. So basically, how do you teach radiation risk after this disaster? And I went to a lot of centers that had been specifically created after the disaster to teach radiation to children. And here, for instance, you have a little model where children can learn to decontaminate Fukushima by playing. And what I've realized is that often this educational infrastructure was very asymmetrical in the way that they presented information about radiation risk. So one of the first things that often kept creeping up was the use of natural analogies. So a lot of these centers said, for instance, well, radiation, it's also natural. It comes from the sun, it comes from the potassium in the banana that we eat. And these natural analogies, they were really useful to transform the kind of former ideas that people had about radiation from something that was initially associated with something mysterious, the byproduct of nuclear power plant, to something that was a common occurrence, so radiation from the sun, radiation in the rock, and so on. The problem was that these analogies, they did not convey necessarily the complexity of radiation dangers. They were also very specific in the way that they talk about risk. The second point was the use of cute aesthetics. So if you went to Japan, you know that the Japanese love cute stuff. And here, I do not want to criticize the aesthetics of cuteness. That will be a form of ethnocentrism. Cuteness is really well accepted within Japanese society. But it was rather used against to promote, atmosphere of pleasant and accessible experience. A lot of people told me that, well, radiation is very scary for children to understand. And if we can put some information through a medium that help them to not necessarily be scared, well, then we can provide some useful information. Again, one of the problem is that the information that was produced via these aesthetics was very asymmetrical. So for instance, children, they could learn about the specific radioactive pollutants after a disaster, but there were no in-depth discussion about what happened if you ingest or inhale these pollutants. What are the specific risks? And finally, there was also the wonder of science and technology. A lot of these centers basically said, well, of course, radiation is scary, but it can also save life. They're saying, for instance, that medical equipment can be used to, save life if you have a cancer. And when I basically asked to people, why are you making these comparisons? Because it's not exactly the same thing as a disaster. A lot of them told me that, well, after the disaster, basically, we had no good student that wanted to enter nuclear-related science. So basically, the States was also doing this to try to revitalize nuclear-related interests for a generation that was too young to remember the disaster or that did not want to go into nuclear science. And it's very interesting if you go to these centers and then you go to the museum in Hiroshima, where basically we're going to talk to you about radiation, but in a very, very specific ways. If you go to the Hiroshima Museum, you basically see people with melting skin, with hair falling down, because the politics behind this is very different. It's basically a politics that attempts to transform a former military aggressor, Japan, into the first victims of nuclear bombing. But in Fukushima, we have rather a politics of revitalization, which drastically affects how do we perform, how do we materialize risk and harm. And finally, I've already talked to you about citizen science, but now I want to talk about another facets of citizen science. And one of the things that I've realized is that there is also a lot of citizen scientists who have used their data to promote a politics of revitalization, to say, well, we believe that Fukushima is safe. We want to come back to Fukushima. So something very different from what I've talked about it. And basically, what you have was a part of citizen science that also evolved in collaboration with this official politics of radioactive governance. And while it's useful, I also want to point the fact that citizen science can lead to reduced public expenditure, minimal government intervention, and also risk privatization, meaning that risk becomes a matter of personal business. Basically, this collaboration was happening for three reasons. So the first reason is the interpretation of raw data. Of course, it's nice and swell to produce data, but what do you do after the number? How do you interpret it? And often I saw a lot of citizen scientists produce the same data, but interpret this data drastically different. Some people saying this is safe, some people saying this is dangerous. What explains this difference in interpretation? The first one is that surveillance tools can produce a lot of information, but it can also produce ignorance. And a lot of citizen scientists, they basically use different monitoring tool. And these monitoring tools, they did not show the same kinds of aspects of radiation hazards. So sometimes people had partial understanding of the scope and scale of risk. Secondly, the very concept of interpreting radiation risk, it's very problematic in a nuclear concept. There's a lot of people that have put forward the fact that there's a history of secrecy and propaganda that drastically shape how we understand risk. So just for instance, the politics of the Cold War have drastically shaped the understanding of security by putting international security to the forefront rather than national security. And science is not necessarily purer once it's mobilized by citizens. It comes with its own legacy. And there's also other factors, such as age. For instance, when I met a farmer, the farmer told me, how old are you? And at the time, I must have been like 27. He said, well, I'm 75 years old. I might be dead in 2 or 3 years from natural cause. So radiation risk, it's not a risk for me. Secondly, you also have citizen scientists who have very similar understanding of recovery from that of the states. So a lot of citizens told me, well, health risk from radiation is just one of the many, many, many problems that we had. And the image on the right is basically soil. So a lot of citizen scientists have also monitored soil, and they realized that the soil was very contaminated. And that's something that the government was not measuring. And when I asked these citizen scientists, what are you going to do with this soil? Are you going to try to sue the government for some risk? And the person told me, I can't do that because if I do that, I'm going to be indirectly killing my neighbor. He's not going to be able to sell his house. He's not going to be able to sell his stuff. So people were keenly aware of how data was intrinsically linked also with some of the community well-being. If they were using this data for political purpose, it might also create a much more fragmented community. So these people, they basically use their data to ease the tension and ease the anxieties in their everyday life, but not to put the politics of victimization. And finally, we also see a lot of tropes of empowerment. Basically, there's a lot of different international organizations, often linked with the nuclear lobby, that promoted tropes of empowerment to enable people to continue their life in contaminated areas. In the jargon, this takes the name of practical radiological protection culture. So they're going to tell you things such as, well, try testing your food before eating it. If you go outside, wear a dosimeter. This is often framed as an issue of free will. So the organization are going to say, for instance, we're not forcing people to stay. We're just giving them tool to have an easier life in Fukushima. So it's a framework that seems to provide agency, but a lot of these choices are also constrained by structural factors. That is, people, they don't have the option to evacuate. Sometimes if the government is not giving them money, they don't have other option. So it's a philosophy that also promotes a very limited range of choice, which is mostly a monitoring agenda. And this can take a toll on the people because it can become a full-time job. It costs money, it takes effort, it can be very hard. So at first, it's a much more active participation of citizens in nuclear tragedy, not something that we saw after Chernobyl, not something that we saw after Three Mile Island, not to the same degree. But it's also a shift that has a lot of problem for me. The first problem is that this is a narrative that's going to transform the very nature of radiation risk as a subjective risk, because citizens can now supposedly choose their own acceptable level of risk. And lowering exposure, it's no longer framed as a fundamental human right. It became reframed as a private goal. So radiation risk, it's not a hazard imposed by the nuclear industry, it's a matter of personal choice. Are you comfortable with eating some level of radiation in your food? It's up to you. So these tropes of empowerment, they also obfuscate the notion of responsibility because they depict the nuclear catastrophe as an accident that can be managed free of charge by citizens that have the right attitude. It's also a philosophy that erased the very concepts of victimhood. If you look into the document produced by this organization, we don't talk about victims anymore. We talk about stakeholders. And there's a drastic difference between a stakeholder and a victim. You don't have to compensate a stakeholder the same way you need to compensate the victims. So, of course, there are some people that don't want to have their experience reduced to the concept of victimhood. But as academic, we also need to look at what kinds of industry are best served by the disappearance of this very concept of victimhood. These monitoring practice, they're also going to shape the subjectivities of people. That when I was speaking with people, a lot of the people had started to blame themselves. So instead of blaming the bigger structure that put them in this context in the first place, people start to blame themselves, saying, well, I shouldn't have ate those mushrooms, but they're so good. I shouldn't have gone do some hiking because the exposure is too high. So basically, and I'm going to conclude very soon, we're seeing two types of citizen science. The first one that tried to put forward a politics of victimization that has failed, and this other one that put forward a politics of revitalization and that is being encouraged and even co-opted. And the nuclear lobby was really impressed by what they saw in Fukushima. For instance, in France, where they use 70% of their energy come from nuclear power, they're trying to do something similar. So they're trying to put citizen science initiative around places where there is nuclear power plants. So in case a disaster happens, it can be managed by the citizens. So for me, basically, the danger lie in a normalization of risk that produce society where citizens have to take care of themselves amidst increasingly polluted environment while interpreting partial data about controversial danger. And very quickly, basically, we can see that there's been a lot of major local change, a lot of also change in the governance of disaster, but there's still a lot of business as usual in that Fukushima has not bring a kind of drastic rethinking of a relationship with energy production. And I want to argue that Fukushima might represent the end of nuclear disaster. And when I say that Fukushima represents the end of nuclear disaster, I'm not saying that there's not going to be other nuclear accident. What I'm saying is that it might represent the end of a former imaginary, where nuclear catastrophe represents a drastic event, a shift from somewhat prior normal state. And to the right, there's a very specific plant. In fact, there's so much waste from decontamination that the government does not know what to do with it. And they're trying to reuse this waste. They call it recycled soil in different projects. And they reuse some of the soil to make potted plants. So we are in a context where the aftermath of a nuclear disaster has been normalized to a potted plant, hence my argument that there might not be any more nuclear disaster. It's also interesting if we put it in comparison with the concept of the Anthropocene, the period where humans have thought to have permanently affected the heart. And, can we even have a concept of disaster in the concept of the Anthropocene. But I want to end on a more cheerful note, and this image from my fieldwork, which I have never forgotten. It's a little kid that was literally born in a temporary housing. So a little stakeholder of the future, hopefully not in the neoliberal sense. And I think we can learn a lot from this other little boy in reference to the first bomb that was dropped, as we ourselves tried to walk the scorched heart of the Anthropocene. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Polleri. While we wait for people to enter their questions in the Q&A function in Zoom, I thought I would start out by asking you one question that might be slightly outside the scope of your book, but you certainly touched on it in your discussion of citizen science at the end, which is in looking at this, the response to this disaster in Japan, how much do you think this was a reflection of things that are particular to Japanese society and politics, and how much do you think are aspects of disaster response in the future that are a product of just how the contemporary world and how international society works nowadays? So how much
So,
is particular to Japan, and
yeah,
how much do you think is the other states will follow this model?
yeah. So first, I'm going to start with what is beyond Japan. And one of the things that we see is that this kind of much more active participation of citizen, it was really, really pushed forward after the Chernobyl disaster, but especially after the end of the Soviet Union. So basically, when the Chernobyl disaster happened, it really scared nuclear lobbies, nuclear corporations, saying, well, if there's another disaster that happened, it might represent the end of her industry. But it was very hard to try to penetrate the Soviet Union during the Cold War because of the secrecy, because of the bad relationship between different countries. And after the end of the Cold War, well, you basically had this era of cooperation, and a lot of different organizations were able to try to implement these kinds of citizen science initiative that I've talked about. So they were implemented by different organization that says, well, you don't necessarily have to evacuate. And also at the time, you had newly formed states like Belarus or Ukraine that had to deal with the very heavy costs of the legacy of Chernobyl. There's one author that says, for instance, that I think that the cost of remediation from Chernobyl for Belarus was close to 20% of the whole national cost, which was extreme. So a lot of states also embrace these kinds of practice. But this was really put forward by the international organization. The specificity, I think, of the Japanese case was that this was not necessarily imposed by these organizations. A lot of citizens actually reach out to these organizations. So a lot of these citizens basically said, well, the government always said that no disaster could happen, and now I'm left on my own. I don't have necessarily the I don't necessarily have the tool to take care of it. So a lot of citizens reach out to it. And basically, there's a very also neoliberal aspects in this, where basically, and when I talk about neoliberalism, I go beyond the language of economy to say basically how risk can also be delegated onto the shoulder of citizen science. And this kind of tropes of neoliberalism, it never really work well in Japan because you have the importance of the group, you have the importance of groupism. So a lot of Japanese politicians have also tried to put this narrative of now it's an era of self-responsibility. You need to take your own responsibility. They call it jiko sekinen. And the interesting thing is that if you look at the citizen scientists that use radiation to promote a politics of evacuation, they are doing this jiko sekinen. They are taking their self-responsibility, but it's a form of self-responsibility that clashes with these broader tropes of the importance of the group, about who decide what is best for the groups. So you basically have people that are acting according to the tenet of neoliberalism, that are acting according to this let's take care of yourself, but it's still considered bad because it doesn't goes with the politics or the direction of the states. And when citizens are doing this in regard to what the state considered to be a good form of revitalization, well, it's considered to be good. So I think this really tells us a lot about the texture of neoliberalism in Japan that is very, very different from what you see in the United States, what you see in the UK, precisely because historically speaking, you had these tropes about the group is very important. You need to think about the group before thinking about the individuality. So people don't really seem how to juggle this discourse of individual responsibility with also this discourse of group responsibility.
Great. So I have sort of a follow-up or related question, which is I found it very striking in your discussion of your book that there's sort of this generalized effort to either discredit expertise or tell people to develop their own expertise. So like the state is, undermining the expertise of certain nuclear experts because it's inconvenient. There's a division within sort of the people doing citizen science because they don't agree about what the results show and they have their own ideas about how they respond. And it struck me that that's something that's happening in other areas around the world, the anti-vaccine movement, misinformation about politics, fake news, etc. I just wonder if you could, discuss that. Is that another phenomenon of the contemporary era where people are encouraged to do quote unquote their own research?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this really, there's the anthropologist Vincent Yalanti who basically says that we're living in an era of a crisis of expertise. And I think that citizen science is really a symptom of this broader crisis of expertise. And historically speaking, I mean, it's easy to understand why. For many decades, top experts, top political official basically said a disaster cannot happen. It's a Souteigai in Japanese. It's unimaginable. It's unexpectable, and it did happen. So in this regard, I mean, of course, it can be very hard to basically, trust the experts when the experts have told you that nothing could happen. Um, Also, a lot of the problem with expertise is that expertise cannot answer sometimes case by case problems. So like a lot of the questions that people had were very, very specific question. Is it safe for my children? Is it safe for me? And experts are not able to talk in these kind of very, very specific ways. Sometimes they'll be able to tell you some generalized comments about, well, if the radiation level is X and this amount of things, that might work. But one of the things that we saw is how, in a way, local community or localness becomes more and more important to put forward expertise. And even, the very name citizen science, it's a complex word. I mean, there's a lot of different citizen within citizen science, and this is going to drastically influence how people, talk, perceive, understand this disaster. And the same goes with science. Basically, what these people have done is they have not created a new science. That's very important to put forward. They have not put forward an alternative ways of, understanding radiation, something that, for instance, the Soviet tried to do in their story. Basically, what they meant by science was simply a monitoring agenda, a tracking agenda. And this also come with its own pitfall. And it was one of the big problems that I had when I was reading the literature on Fukushima. And I think it's a problem especially apparent in anthropologists, because anthropologists works with, small people, so to speak. We want to root for the small guy. And a lot of people basically says, well, what citizen science is doing is wonderful. It's much more democratic. Not necessarily. It can also create its own problem. Again, science doesn't become pure simply because it's mobilized by people. Mm.
Great. Let's go to some questions from the audience. I'm going to first go to Siegfried Hecker. Sig, I'm going to unmute you to see if you're able to ask your question. If not, I will read your question to Dr. Polleri. Okay, you should be able to speak now, Sig.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear
Oh,
you.
very good. So Maxime, first of all, great job. I learned a lot, beautiful research. The question that I have with the sort of citizen science or the greater involvement of the citizenry in these nuclear matters, have they also been able to put more pressure on the Japanese government to develop a more independent regulator for the nuclear
Mm.
industry? That's the question. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Shig. And again, I would like to thank you for all these years of mentoring, all the discussion I had with you. They've really shaped also the tone of the book, the tone of the book, and how I've read the book. So a lot of citizen science have initially, tried to put more pressure on the government, and they have not really been successful in putting this pressure. So sometime, for instance, regarding like the contaminated soil, some people basically, try to put pressure saying, what are you going to do for the soil? And basically, in some context, the government did not do anything. Um, so I don't, there's a political potential to their work, but I don't really see it having affected, for instance, the nuclear regulator. What we saw a lot is that after the disaster, basically, the former nuclear regulator were disbanded, and the Japanese government at the time created a whole new nuclear regulator, the NRA, Nuclear Regulatory Agency. So on paper, it looks wonderful. It looks like it's finally independent. It looks like it's an independent regulator, which was nice because at the beginning, you had this ministry, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, that was promoting nuclear power at the same time that it was taking care of the safety. So that was a clear case of collusion. This no longer has happened. But the big problem is that a lot of the former employees in these former agencies have been rehired in this kind of new nuclear regulatory agency. So on paper, the name have changed a lot, but there's some scholars that show that this new nuclear regulatory agency is composed of 70% of former people. So we can expect that these people are also going to bring their own culture. I mean, a culture does not change quickly. It takes a lot of time. So I don't think that citizen science was necessarily successful. They've tried a lot, but I think there was a lot of fatigue also, realizing that the government was not necessarily listening. So that's why they really kept what they were doing for themselves sometimes.
Thank you.
Right, right. I'm going to go to Tom Finger next. And Tom, you should be able to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Let me echo Sigurd in an excellent presentation, so thank you very much. That given the attention to hydrocarbon supply created by the war on Iran, based on your findings, how do you anticipate that increased awareness of vulnerabilities in oil and gas supply will affect citizen attitudes in Japan and Japanese government policy with respect to not just nuclear, but other sustainable sources of energy?
Yeah, I can't say I'm really an expert in political economy, but I think if we look back at history, the first oil shock in the 70s was really, really important in, pushing forward this development of nuclear power. Um, I really don't think we're going to see necessarily the disappearance of nuclear energy. You know, what might be much harder is that after Fukushima, citizens have been very wary of some type of energetic infrastructure like nuclear power. So it might be very, very hard for government to create new nuclear power plants, unless they try to spin it and saying like, well, we're going to do something different, like a small modular reactor. But I cannot see necessarily like the citizen accepting new nuclear power being made under soil, because they've seen the aftermath of they've seen the aftermath of Fukushima, because they're seeing what happens in Iran, or we can think also with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where basically, nuclear power plants were targeted, and that created additional governance problem. Basically what happened when you have nuclear power plants in situation of wartime, it creates whole new conceptualization, whole new understanding of this risk and benefit balance that were not necessarily calculated. And Japan has also bad relationship with a lot of different countries. A lot of the time they see missile going over from North Korea going over them. So I think the government is going to keep pushing nuclear power, the current nuclear power that they have, saying that, well, it's a form of independence. It's associated with their expertise. It's going to fight global warming. And for alternative energy, I mean, I've not been hearing much about this, but definitely the political elites are looking at what's being done. And one of the things that set Japan apart also is that they have a lot of oil reserves, so like they can wait longer than other country for sure. But at the same time, citizen, they really have a strong word to say in this. So like even when there was a lot of anti-nuclear demonstration after the disaster, all these anti-nuclear demonstration that had hundreds of thousands of people, they were not enough to basically bring Japan to rethink its energy infrastructure. It was still very, very much business as usual, even regarding all these manifestations.
Thank you. So I'm going to read a question now from an anonymous attendee because I don't see them online anymore. It asks the question, how effective has Furusato been in bringing residents back to the area compared with their intent to remain where a new community has been formed? What's the balance between those two groups of displaced persons?
So, sorry, can you reread the question again, please?
Sure. How effective has Furusato been in bringing back residents to the area, presumably Fukushima, compared with those displaced persons who have formed a new community in temporary housing and intend to stay there?
So basically, in both cases, it was very hard. So the pushing forward of the native land has more or less been successful, because often, as I was saying, people they came back to their region, but sometimes they come back to ghost town. The whole community that was here does not exist. Also, a lot of people were elderly, so now they are even older. They're back in communities where there's no doctor, there's no taxi, there's no bus service, so it creates a lot of additional problem. So a lot of people have kind of were not necessarily looking to come back, but they were in a way forced to, because there was after a certain time, you couldn't live in evacuation, in temporary evacuation, so you had to come back to your Furusato. And in some cases, this was a shock that was so big that some people die from it. So I have known, for instance, an elderly lady that had been living for 6 years in this temporary housing, and actually she really loved it, because before the disaster, Fukushima was also a very depopulated and poor place. So a lot of these people were sometimes living by themselves, and they find a whole new community there. And when they lose this community, it was too big of a shock, and they died. So basically, now the government is in a problem where a lot of the former evacuees, they don't want to come back to their native land because of these problems. There's also the fact, for instance, that 5 or 6 years, it's not that big of a deal when you're 60 or 70, but there was a lot of young people, for instance. So I had like a mother that told me, when we evacuated, my daughter was 10, now she's 15. I mean, she's a young woman. She doesn't have any more attachment to the land. So basically, the government has put millions of dollars to promote this Furusato, this native land initiative, but it's faced with a lot of people that don't want to come back. So now what they're doing is that they're putting shames and saying, well, people that didn't evacuate, if you come to Fukushima to revitalize, we're going to give you money, we're going to give you a job. But that creates other problem, because the people that sometimes accept to go there are the people that are financially strapped, are already precarious population. So you have a whole new population, sometimes urban people, that came back to these new region, and that creates other tension with the former community that came back, saying, well, hey, we had to kind of fight for all this, we had to suffer. These people, they didn't have to suffer, and they get all the benefits that we get. So unfortunately, it create a lot of tensions also. So there's no win-win situation for that case.
Thank you for that. So I think we have time for one last question. I'm going to read out one from Ted Robb, who can't unmute. He says, he notes that at sometime after Fukushima, a former head of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission traveled to Japan as a private citizen to support nuclear power in Japan at a critical time in the debate. I want to build on that and note, just follow up on your comment early on in your talk about how the Japanese government used international expertise and international organizations to bolster its response, its strategy or response towards the disaster. Can you talk a little bit more about the role of international experts and organizations in responding to the disaster?
Yeah, so that again, it's very interesting if you look at 3 Mile Island, if you look at Chernobyl, where basically the narratives regarding the disaster were really put by the nation state. And in Fukushima, the narrative surrounding the disaster, it was put forward very much by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the World Health Organization, UNSCAR, RCRP. So this network of international expertise that really came to strength after the downfall of the Soviet Union. And basically, they came together at a time because they were very concerned that nation states or politicians had too much power in shaping or defining the discourse of a disaster. And that's something that we saw after Fukushima. So when the disaster happened, Japan was governed by the Democratic Party of Japan, which was kind of exceptional because for a long time it was always the same party, the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, that was at the head. And the prime minister at the time was Naoto Kan, and Naoto Kan quickly became very much vocal in his anti-nuclear positions. And basically, this discourse from a prime minister, it very much clashed with the discourse that the international expertise was putting forward, saying, well, the disaster is not so bad. And they were, in a way, so powerful that they were even able to basically downplay the discourse of the prime minister. So that's something that was very different in regarding who gets to shape what is an official narrative, which is no longer nation states, but an international network of expertise. Even the recommendation that was made to increase the threshold of radiation exposure, it's a decision that was taken by Japan, but it was based on the recommendation of RCRP and the International Committee for Radiological Protection. And RCRP doesn't have legal power. The Japanese state could have very well said, well, we're not going to listen to you. You don't have anything to tell us. We are our own sovereign nation. We can take the decision that we want. But they did follow their recommendation. So that really speaks to the new power, the new expertise of these international expert monopole. One of the things that was also very much crucial in kind of shaping the narrative was the kind of disaster made in Japan. So that's something that that was really pushed forward by these different organizations. So after Chernobyl, one of the things that we've been hearing was that Chernobyl was a Soviet disaster. This was really pushed forward by, again, different international organizations that promoted the concept of nuclear safety. So basically, the concept was that Soviets were biased by their communist ideology. That's why the disaster happened. But the counterpart was that a disaster like this could never happen in the liberal world order. And Japan was the poster child of this liberal world order, was the country that had raised from nuclear ashes from the bombing of World War II to understand the peaceful part of the Atom for Peace. So a disaster like this was never supposed to happen. And basically, after the disaster happened, we had a very similar scenario where basically we started to hear that, okay, perhaps this is a disaster that was made in Japan. You know, the Japanese aren't they prone to groupism? Aren't they think in a group mentality? And the thing that's very interesting is that this made in Japan phrase was very apparent in an independent report that was commissioned by the Diet of Japan, so the parliament, the equivalent of the parliament or the Senate in the States, sorry. And in the Japanese document, there is no mention of this disaster made in Japan. It only appears in the English version. And this phrase was really picked up by different international organizations and really pushed forward and saying, well, look, this is a disaster made in Japan. And one of the problems that I have with this is that it kind of sometimes, again, put forward the specificity of cultural nations. It's almost a form of racism, saying like, well, basically some nations are not good or evolved enough to understand what is a proper risk and so on. And it still says, well, this disaster cannot happen in other places. So the role of this organization was very much different from what we've been seeing in 3 Mile Island or even regarding other nuclear tragedies like thermonuclear explosion, which created a lot of fallout. And sometimes citizens were unaware of what was happening. States had tight control of secrecy.
Well, we're at time, so everyone please join me in thanking Professor Polleri for an excellent talk on a very interesting book. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.